Welcome to Environmental Law Explored, a podcast series, the podcast of the American Bar Association section of Environment, Energy, and Resources. SEER is a member organization whose mission is to foster the success of a diverse community of environmental, energy, and resources lawyers, advisors, law students, and decision makers, and provide a premier forum for the exchange of ideas and information.
Welcome to the 8th and final episode of the section of Environment, Energy, and Resources Microplastics podcast. My name is Kevin Minoli, and it's my pleasure today to welcome two great panelists, Megan Baroni, who is a partner at Robinson+Cole, LLP, where she focuses her practice on a variety of environmental health and safety issues, and Sarah Morath, an associate professor at Wake Forest University School of Law, and the author of Our Plastic Problem and How to Solve It, from Cambridge University Press in 2022. Megan and Sarah are here today to talk to us about the litigation landscape as it relates to microplastics and what we can see or expect to see in the future. And so, as I have with other podcast sessions, we'd like to start today's session just by asking you, when I say microplastics, you think of what?
I guess I'll start. I think of the word ubiquity. I think that's what I think of, and the fact that microplastics pretty much permeate our environment and have made their way into all sorts of places that we wouldn't expect to find them, from drinking water to the soil to ice sheets and into our bloodstream. So ubiquity is the word I think of when I hear microplastics.
Well, Sarah and I think are on the same page, because that was the same word that I thought of. That microplastics are everywhere. We've seen this with other emerging contaminants in the past, where, we're just learning about their impact on the environment and human health, but we know that they are everywhere. And so when you know that things are everywhere, as a lawyer, that's likely to lead to a lot of liability across the board for many different parties. And given the pervasive use of plastics in our world, that liability is likely to reach pretty far and wide.
How does one sort of figure out who's going to be held liable when you have something that is quite as ubiquitous as microplastics are?
I think plaintiffs are telling us who's going to be liable. I think what we're seeing is that there's relatively little action, or there is stagnant action or stagnation happening at the federal level when it comes to regulating plastics. And so you see a lot of movement recently in courts, and with plaintiffs sort of identifying who they think should be held responsible. And we see it across the life cycle of plastic, from the producers all the way to those who are manufacturing pellets, to those who ship pellets, to those who use those pellets to make plastic products. So I think a lot of it is being driven by what the plaintiffs see, or who the plaintiffs see as being the responsible parties.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And, it really probably has started in the world of plastics in general, not necessarily microplastics. There have been, quite a few lawsuits brought by plaintiffs under existing statutory and regulatory regimes for, against plastics manufacturers for contaminating the environment with their plastics as a result of their manufacturing. Certainly, there have been many lawsuits against bottling companies that, we all think of bottling as a large use of plastic. There haven't been too many lawsuits yet to focus on microplastics specifically, but as the science develops with regard to analytical methods, as the regulations develop specific to microplastics, as opposed to just plastics in general. And, I know that this podcast series has covered some of the developments out in California, the fact that the definition of microplastics is being developed as microplastics in drinking water. That I think is a signal that maybe the next round of litigation that we might see might involve contamination of drinking water supplies with microplastics, and the need to try to determine who would be responsible for those. So once we get into that environment, I think we're going to see the cast of potential defendants expand into users of plastics, and maybe more into the microplastics realm, where, it's not just producers of plastics, of microplastics, but producers of plastics that break down in the environment and then can contaminate the environment. And then maybe a little further down the road, which I will get to later in this episode, would be toxic tort type lawsuits related to microplastics exposure.
Are we seeing any litigation against the government for either action or failure to act?
Yeah, there have been some fairly recent lawsuits. Again, Megan pointed out that we're talking about plastics generally, and sort of this realm of microplastics is a little more narrow. But I do think that we've seen some action against the EPA for failure to designate bodies as being impaired because of plastic pollution. That was a case in the District of Hawaii. We've seen litigation against the Army Corps of Engineers for approving permits where refineries were going to be developed that would then be producing these pellets. And those are just a couple of examples of TMDLs is another example where NGOs have sued the EPA for failing to appropriately consider sort of the regulations under the Clean Water Act. So we see both the plastic producers and those who use plastics, but we also see some litigation for sort of spurring action on the side of government to sort of better regulate and better address the ways in which plastic contaminates our environment.
I was just going to say, just to follow up on that, yeah, I think it has been interesting to see some of that action where, plaintiffs are using these existing statutes, probably most commonly the Clean Water Act, to pursue plastics discharges. And the Hawaii case is interesting because, that was a plaintiffs group essentially, saying that the state of Hawaii was not considering plastics pollution in their water bodies and identifying them as impaired under the Clean Water Act, Section 303D. And they were actually successful in getting Hawaii to change that. So, it's sort of these baby steps, I think, of using the existing legislation and also focusing on plastics, not necessarily just microplastics, but showing these governments how they can consider plastics under the regimes that are already in place, as opposed to waiting for new laws or new regulations to be passed.
And does that extend to state laws as well, either state statutory provisions or state common law claims?
Yeah, we're seeing action also arising in state court. Again, this is sort of the novelty of plastics in our environment and sort of recognizing the harm that they cause. So some new lawsuits or sort of creative lawsuits that plaintiffs have brought have been under sort of public nuisance laws in California, and that's specific, again, not about microplastics, but plastics in general. That's against a bottling company, and some strict liability and nuisance claims were included in that litigation as well. And then also consumer protection laws are being used. Again, this is still sort of kind of tangential and looking at where we are going to see future litigation go, but I think we're going to see a lot of false and deceptive claims being brought against maybe the users or the manufacturers, those who are using plastic to make a product that they're putting out in the marketplace and saying that it's recyclable, when in fact we know that only 9% or 10% of our plastic is recycled. So we've seen some false and deceptive claims being brought in state court as well against, again, the bottling companies, but sort of more of the end users of the plastic. But there's lots of activity going on there as well.
Yeah, and in addition to those consumer protection claims, there have also been some plaintiffs groups bringing tort claims as well. We started by saying nuisance, there's some negligence, strict liability. In at least one case, the plaintiffs group is actually seeking recovery of damages for costs that they've incurred in addressing plastics pollution. So, it's not like these lawsuits are just seeking injunctive relief, for companies to stop saying that their products are as recyclable as they're claiming, but also in some instances to recover real dollars for addressing the pollution that's caused by plastics.
That will certainly be one of the cases to really watch to see, because I imagine if that case is successful, there'll be a lot more like it across the country. Going back to the recyclability claims and the sort of greenwashing sorts of issues, I know that greenwashing is spurring a lot of litigation just across industry in general as people try to better tout their environmental benefits or the environmental qualities of their products. Are we seeing greenwashing claims or allegations of greenwashing in this context as well?
Yeah, we are. And again, we know that the FTC issues guidance through the green guides, and they have statements about what we can say in terms of recyclability and biodegradability. But there has been a recent case involving Keurig coffee cups, which actually resulted in a settlement again and a hefty payment made by Keurig that involved claims of recyclability when they are in fact not recyclable. So we see the Federal Trade Commission being involved in these greenwashing claims, again, mostly focused on recyclability or biodegradability. But that's, again, I think, as you noted, Kevin, that there's a lot of activity about greenwashing generally when it comes to like claims of commitments to climate change or emissions and things like that. And so just as firms and industries are alert to what they're saying about their CO2 emissions, they're going to have to start to be alert to what they're saying about their recyclability and biodegradability of the products that they're putting on the marketplace.
Yeah, and those greenwashing claims are finding their way into shareholder derivative suits as well. There was a suit that was filed. It's since been dismissed, but it was a shareholder derivative suit filed against Danimer Scientific. Essentially, the company was claiming that one of its plastics products would be fully degradable in the environment within 12 to 18 weeks. That it was 100% biodegradable in the environment. And there was a big expose in the Wall Street Journal where those claims were called into question. And the next day, the stock price dropped by almost 13%. And a shareholder filed a derivative suit. So these greenwashing suits are not just being brought by non-governmental organizations trying to protect the environment. They may also be brought by a company's shareholders who's looking to protect their own investment.
Are we seeing much action in the way of, attorney generals and sort of states and localities taking up the litigation front here? We could talk in a minute about sort of what the state legislatures might be doing and what we might expect from them. But are you seeing much action in the realm of the state sort of enforcement agencies like the attorneys general or the environmental agencies of each state?
So interestingly, we are starting to see some activity there. So there's two recent examples, both from 2022, so really recently, where the Connecticut Attorney General brought an action against a manufacturer of trash bags and claims of recyclability that this trash bag company was making, despite knowing that in Connecticut, those kinds of bags could not be recycled. And that was brought under Connecticut's Unfair Trade Practices Act. And then similarly, which has gotten a lot of press, was the Attorney General investigating ExxonMobil out in California, again, going along with these recyclability claims and greenwashing, perhaps, and sort of alleging that ExxonMobil has known for a long time that the process it engages in to create the plastic pellets and the plastic that eventually gets put out into the marketplace is not, in fact, easily recyclable, and knew this, and despite that was engaging in an ad campaign to kind of promote the recyclability of plastic. So those are just two examples of attorney generals kind of becoming involved in this problem, which seems to have no easy solution right now.
What I find interesting about some of these cases is that on the recyclability front, the fact that something is or is not recyclable may be both a scientific question and a practical question in terms of something may be recyclable as a fact, but maybe not in your community and not in your state. And so it'll be interesting to see if states sort of focus in on what they offer for recyclable or recyclability of products versus what is technically feasible if people wanted to. I just find it interesting to see where the the state sort of is the one that provides the recyclability and provides recycling in most communities. And so they have a lot of ability to impact sort of what can be recycled and what can't.
That's kind of an interesting point too, because, there are so many consumers clamoring about the fact that recyclability should really be something that is borne by the producer, right? So there are a lot of states developing extended producer responsibility laws to try to generate funds to enhance their ability to recycle in the state, to sort of create this cradle to grave notion for, companies. If you're going to produce this plastic item, you need to think about its entire life cycle, as opposed to, what we all know happened with plastics, which was to sort of put this responsibility on recycling on the consumer and make it seem like something that this is something that you should do as the consumer, and, be a good steward of the environment and recycle, as opposed to, companies assuming that obligation themselves and investing dollars to enhance the ability to recycle those products. So I think you're going to start to see those types of laws more and more. There are a few states that have adopted them already. They're pretty popular around the globe, and we're likely to see a lot more of that happening. And frankly, even industry groups, doing the same. Where the government hasn't yet passed laws, there are industry groups that are trying to look at the issue of recyclability of their products, both from the product production perspective and then from the actual recyclability perspective.
I grew up in Vermont, where we had the bottle deposit bill that's always been in effect, and have fond memories of doing bottle drives when we were, at Little League, to try to raise money for our team. Those incentives can be successful in terms of motivating people. What else are you seeing out of state legislatures related to plastics? I know California is a particular leader. Are there, what's going on there, and what are we seeing in other states if we are?
California is really leading the way at this point. And I do think we have a great episode that dives into that in more detail. But sort of as we mentioned earlier, they've developed a definition of microplastics in drinking water that ranges from 1 nanometer to 5,000 micrometers, from you can't see it to about the size of a pea. And, that definition is sort of the kickoff of how California might move forward to regulate. The thing coming along now is the determination of a sampling methodology. From my perspective, I think once we see a sampling methodology that people think is reliable, and something that's generally accepted as a good methodology for sampling for microplastics, if it's accessible to people and they can do it on their own, or groups can do it on their own, I think you'll start to see even more litigation take off, because, once you can test that it's there, and many people can do that, that's really going to kick off the litigation. But yeah, I think it's at this point really California leading the way, and a lot of folks watching to see what they're doing there.
Yeah, California is also, not the point of this podcast, but is also sort of phasing out single-use plastics. So we see a lot of states banning single-use plastics, which is a way to eliminate plastics from our environment, or at least reduce the amount. But sort of kind of going back to your point, Kevin, about like recycling, and I think what's really interesting is what we think of as recycling can differ between individuals. And so I'm on the side where I don't think this new method of recycling called advanced recycling or chemical recycling is recycling. I think there's a whole camp that thinks that this new technology is more incineration. You're actually like burning the plastic to create fuel or some other product. But there's arguments on both sides. But so what we see right now in terms of what state legislatures are doing is they're doing a carve out for this advanced recycling or these chemical recycling initiatives, so that instead of being sort of lumped under solid waste management laws, that they would be exempt. It's sort of a different process. We see 20 states in the past 5 years alone have created state laws that sort of exempt this kind of process from the more stringent laws that would be the more stringent regulations that they would be required to follow under solid waste laws. And it's so active that we see the EPA sort of getting involved and looking at rulemaking and thinking about how to regulate these processes under the Clean Air Act. So I actually think that's where a lot of activity is going on. It's sort of like undercurrents. I've been thinking about this for 2 years now and writing about like someone should be addressing chemical recycling, but I think the state legislatures in red states are kind of hip to it and are sort of exempting these activities. But that's another area where I think industry is aware that there might be these regulations saying you need to have a certain amount of recycling happening, or you have to say that this is a recycled product. And so they're thinking about other ways that they can not engage in mechanical recycling because that's expensive and requires a lot of infrastructure, and instead engage in this kind of advanced recycling or chemical recycling processes.
Can you just, for those folks who may not be up to speed on sort of what chemical or advanced recycling is, can you just give just a brief, introduction to what you're talking about when you talk about that?
So there's two processes that are involved generally when we talk about advanced or chemical recycling. One is called pyrolysis and the other is called gasification. And so in general, it could be either sort of a burning or process that is happening with the plastic to create some other product. It's when we think of recycling that you were talking about, Kevin, with the bottles, that process is mechanical recycling, where we sort of chomp up the plastic and we clean it and then we kind of melt it down again into another bottle or another kind of product. That's typically what we think of when we think of recycling. Advanced recycling or chemical recycling is usually involves some sort of burning or gasification process. You liquefy the plastic, and then a lot of times it can be used for things like fuel or some other kind of energy source. And so we know in the EPA's hierarchy of waste management that incineration falls below recycling. And so a lot of folks are arguing that these processes are actually incineration, and so we should treat them like incineration. Whereas the individuals, the entities that are interested, the plastic companies that are interested in promoting advanced recycling are saying, no, it's in this recycling. It's one step above that. Again, there's arguments on both sides, but it's just something to be aware of. It is not the same as mechanical recycling and what the consumer thinks of when they think of recycling.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I want to go back to something that I think Megan touched on earlier, which is derivative suits. For publicly traded companies. How often are we seeing those sorts of shareholder-driven actions? And, how much should a publicly traded company be concerned about, that possibility for them?
So I think we're seeing the non-governmental organizations kind of taking the charge on the greenwashing suits over the derivative suits so far. I haven't really done a survey of that, but certainly I think it, when you're reading the trade publications, it seems to be the trend. However, with ESG just sort of growing bigger and bigger in everyone's minds every day, the SEC getting involved with, not specifically microplastics regulation, but, trying to get into climate change regulation, talking about greenwashing in the investment context. It's definitely becoming a part of sort of the regular mainstream vocabulary of consumers and investors. And so, people are going to protect their investments. And if they are seeing companies make claims with regard to environmental, sustainability, recycling, and those claims aren't bearing out, and stock prices are dropping, I think we can expect to continue to see these derivative suits.
All right, as we come to the end of our time here, where do you really see us being in the future on microplastics, and what should we be on the lookout for?
So Sarah and I talked a little bit about this yesterday. I look at the PFAS litigation as a bit of an example here of where we might go with microplastics. PFAS are ubiquitous. Microplastics might be even more ubiquitous, might be even more used by humans around the globe. And so right now what we're seeing is the litigation focusing on the plastics producers, kind of like what we saw with PFAS litigation focusing on manufacturers of PFAS. But as information continues to grow, as those companies start paying out significant dollars to, deal with microplastics in the environment or human exposure to microplastics, I think we're going to see that litigation continue down the chain into, plastics users. We talked earlier about the fact that California's definition of microplastics is microplastics in drinking water. There are going to be likely drinking water requirements for sampling to figure out if there are microplastics. And like PFAS, I think we could probably predict that we're going to find microplastics in a lot of drinking water supplies. That's going to require treatment. That's going to cost money. And then drinking, we're going to need to look at who could potentially be responsible for those microplastics. And like with most environmental litigation matters, the net is cast wide. And because so many people use plastics, the net will be very wide here. And I think at the very outset, Sarah mentioned, we've detected microplastics in human bloodstream. So we know there's an invasion into the body, that is likely to be the next place where this might go. Once people are realizing what the human health impacts of microplastics exposure might be, we're going to see those types of lawsuits as well. So while we're sort of focused right now on plastics producers, I think that's really just the tip of the iceberg. And we can see, the examples of that borne out in other types of emerging contaminants.
Yeah, and I just have sort of 2 points on the future too. And one is thinking from the government's perspective, and then the other maybe from the plaintiff's perspective. And one is thinking about the government's awareness of this issue now. And so we see a lot more effort and groups coming together to kind of discuss these contaminants of emerging concerns, which include PFAS, but they lump microplastics into that. And we've seen a recent listing of a plasticizer that's used in plastic on the toxic release inventory, or at least consideration of listing it from the EPA's standpoint. So there is sort of some interest or acknowledgement that the additives to plastic need to be regulated as well, or at least be looked at. And then a separate kind of issue, one that we haven't really touched on, but given that the Biden administration has a push towards environmental justice concerns, I think we have to acknowledge that a lot of the harms that a plaintiff might experience is a plaintiff from a low-income neighborhood, or a neighborhood that is being exposed because they're next to a refinery, or they're next to an industry or a facility that is sort of burning, engaging in advanced recycling. So from the beginning, the life of plastic, to the end of plastic's life, a lot of the communities that are impacted by these processes are Black and Brown communities, and we might see litigation that involves sort of an environmental justice angle as well.
Well, thank you both. This has been a great conversation and a good foreshadowing of what we might expect in the future. Once again, our guests today have been Megan Baroni from Robinson+Cole, LLP, and Sarah Morath from Wake Forest University School of Law, and the author of the book, Our Plastic Problem and How to Solve It. It has been my pleasure today to have this conversation with you. I want to thank you for your time. And I want to thank all of our listeners and all of our other speakers across the previous 7 episodes. It's been a great learning experience for me and for Leland. And it's been our pleasure to host this on behalf of the section of Environment, Energy, and Resources of the APA. Thank you very much.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. To learn more about our section, please visit our website at www.americanbar.org/environ. Please check where you found us for future episodes. Thank you for listening.